Professor Cummings, thanks for joining us. Just to begin, let's define some terms. What is authoritarianism in the context of law and lawyering?
Well, first, thank you for having me and getting out these important issues to the public. I think it's so critical right now. So, when I think about authoritarianism, I think about the idea of using repression as a tool of governance. And I think the important thing to highlight about kind of the new authoritarianism that we see now in the United States, but not just the United States, is that it relies less on overt force than on the appearance of legality. And so you have elections, but the rules have been essentially modified so that there's only one outcome. Or you have a functioning court system, but it's been captured with loyalists in such a way that you bring cases, but the outcomes are foreordained. So the forms look like democracy, but it's not functioning as an authentic democracy should. So I think that's the important point to start off with, which is that we have authoritarianism in our midst, but it's a different format that is using these tools that look like the new authoritarians are following legal conventions, but in fact, they are undermining them.
So, in this new authoritarianism, according to your definition, law seems deeply involved or complicit. Can you talk a little bit about what distinguishes the role of the lawyers in this new authoritarianism versus sort of older authoritarian contexts?
I think one of the important things to highlight about this sort of new authoritarianism, or people call it kind of the new autocracy, is another way of putting it, is that it's really focused on breaking down the institutional checks on executive power. And so, people talk about these big concepts like democracy and democratic backsliding and the rule of law. And these are things that, have multiple definitions and people often disagree about. I think the thing to really focus on in terms of the tools and strategies that are being used by these new autocratic leaders is that they're really trying to figure out what are the institutional guardrails or checks on executive power in the United States, on the president in particular, and how do we break those things down, right? How do we get rid of them so that the executive can essentially do whatever they want and act like a king and not like a elected official? So I think that's the first important starting point, is that that's really what we're up against in terms of this new autocracy. Now, in terms of what distinguishes the role of lawyers and how lawyers are involved in this new process of autocratization, because it is designed to follow at least the conventions and the forms of law, lawyers are the essential ingredient to making this new autocracy work, because they're the ones that have to design, draft, and defend laws that ultimately are designed to target these independent institutional checks on executive power and break down the rule of law. So lawyers are in this fundamentally paradoxical position, I think, of they're sworn to uphold the rule of law, but they get enlisted in these radical projects of breaking down the rule of law and then become the chief architects, essentially, of doing so.
Can you provide some concrete examples of how this is being played out, either in the US context or in other contexts globally?
Sure. I mean, in the US context, I think we can focus on all of the executive orders, the unprecedented number of executive orders that have come out in the first 9 months now of the Trump administration. And these executive orders have been drafted by, reviewed by lawyers. They use legal language and they target independent democratic institutions systematically to try to expand executive power. And we've seen these operate in a number of different contexts. I'll focus on the ones targeting law firms, just as an example of how this operates. So you have a president that issues executive orders saying that law firms have engaged in misconduct and therefore have to be sanctioned. And we can talk about the details of the orders, but essentially what they end up doing is threatening to demolish the client base of big law firms in order to scare them into complicity with the administration and prevent them from taking on cases challenging government overreach, which is what big law firms have done in terms of investing in their pro bono practices. So they're really important now in this regard. So the playbook of the autocrats is to say, hey, look, we know that these law firms are really important to have a functioning democracy because they have the resources to litigate against the government and push back. And so we're going to draft an executive order to target these actors and to essentially disable them and take them out of the game. And that's what we've seen happen. And again, this is a strategy that's been kind of borrowed from other countries. It's been executed by lawyers who are representing the government. And it's been designed to target and disable an aspect of the legal sector that's really important for democracy to function. And that puts up these guardrails against executive power.
How would you respond to comments that, at least in the US context, what's happening with respect to the executive orders are well within the executive or the president's right? And so, in that regard, it's not a violation of the law. In the immigration context, what the president is doing is well within immigration law. So, how would you respond to some of the responses that actually what's happening now isn't autocratic? It's actually fully authorized by the law. In fact, that's a lot of the cases revolve around the legality of it.
I think it's a complex situation, and I think there are different kinds of actions that run up to and sometimes cross the lines of legality. I just mentioned these law firm targeting orders. There were four challenges to the orders. They all were successful. These orders are facially unconstitutional. There's really no argument that could have them survive as a legal matter. And so some of the things that we're seeing are just outright illegal from the outset. And I think every objective observer would agree with that. There are other things, and I think this is the important point to make about this kind of autocratic legalism strategy, right? The strategy of kind of using law and I would say gaps in the law and loopholes within the law, loopholes within the constitutional system, where maybe people wouldn't have done things that way in the past because they thought it was kind of against the norms and traditions of our democratic institutions, but there's nothing actually saying that it's illegal to do this.
Mhm.
So this is the kind of important, sort of strategy of these autocratic legalists of kind of identifying where these gaps exist, and then pushing into the gaps in ways that knock down what were otherwise kind of democratic traditions that would stand in their way. The pioneer of this, which lots of people now have been talking about, is Hungary, which after 2010, the far right populist party there, Fidesz, was voted into power with a 2/3 majority in the parliament. It's a parliamentary system, and under the Hungarian parliamentary system, 2/3 majority actually permits the government to amend the constitution without any additional acts. So in that particular case, it was an example of actually following the legal rules. So Parliament voted on a bunch of legal changes that fundamentally reshaped the democracy. So changed the way, for example, that judges were selected for the courts in a way that allowed the government to pack the court. There was nothing, generally speaking, technically illegal about that because they were following the legal rules, but the intent and the outcome was to fundamentally skew the process in such a way that it gave the prime minister an enormous amount of power. There are other examples of the ways in which law had been changed through legitimate legal process in ways that fundamentally altered the balance of power and now has made it 15 years of of single party rule in a country that's quite diverse. So I think we see similar kinds of things happening now in the United States with respect to following legal rules in a way that, again, is sort of pushing against these. I'll give one example of this, which is the takeover of the Department of Justice in a way that has kind of undercut its traditional tradition of independence. So the Department of Justice has traditionally followed a norm that it's not subject to political interference, right? It doesn't do what the president asks it to do, right? There's a wall between justice and the president. There's nothing constitutional about that wall.
Mhm.
Nothing statutory about that law. That law was that was a norm and a tradition of action. Up until now, people within the Department of Justice, including the former Attorney General under the first Trump administration, William Barr, ultimately took seriously and refused to just do what the president said. That's now been broken, right? That tradition of independence has been broken in a way that has undercut the integrity of the department, but hasn't necessarily violated any specific law. So I think that's a good example of kind of where these norms and traditions get undercut in a way that still seems to operate within of law. Well, the last thing on just that legal, and one of the things that I think is most dangerous about the current moment and the thing that it is implicating lawyers in particular in the most uncomfortable, unethical, and potentially illegal conduct is what I call the manufacturing of factual basis in order to make legal arguments that ultimately would not be able to survive on their own. And I think the immigration space is a place where we see this most significantly. And there are two big examples. One is the false claim that there is an invasion of immigrants from other countries that justifies treating at least some of them as if they're effectively enemy combatants in a war that then legitimizes their removal without due process. And this is something where, again, the forms, the language of law are invoked, and lawyers are involved in kind of creating this mirage, I think, of false facts in order to be able to make these legal claims. And this is a situation in which lawyers are, I think, crossing lines in order to do that. The last example, which is related, is the mobilization of the National Guard in big cities to, crack down on dissent, but also formally to prevent interference with immigration enforcement on the grounds that protesters are systematically undercutting the federal government's ability to enforce immigration law. Again, if you look at the facts on the ground, these able to kind of use the language of these statutes to permit governmental override, essentially, of what would otherwise be important legal checks on executive power. And this is where we're moving into this very dangerous zone where these laws are being invoked on grounds that are really illegitimate, but the debate is really over the legitimacy of the factual predicates for the laws, and this is where things get murky because the government's been able to kind of put out false narratives that people end up accepting, or at least make in ways that are really, really concerning.
So you mentioned Hungary. Are there other examples where we see this autocratic legalism? And what are lawyers in Hungary and on those other places doing to respond to these authoritarian regimes?
I think that the history and the timeline is important in answering this question. There's been authoritarian regimes for a very long time. I mean, you can go back to Nazi Germany. People talk about Mao Zedong in China. There are many examples historically of authoritarian rulers using a lot of similar strategies that we see now. I think the kind of contemporary authoritarianism and this autocratic legalism idea is often associated with the revolution in Hungary after 2010. And then there's been a series of copycats isn't quite the right way to put it, but what I think the thing that's important about this autocratic playbook idea where you have strategies that are developed for autocrats to undercut democratic resistance through these ostensibly legal maneuvers is that they get shared around. And so, there are networks of actors that are sharing strategies very prominently. The Prime Minister of Hungary came back and met with people in the Heritage Foundation when they were developing Project 2025. There were lots of other Hungarian officials that met with high-level Project 2025 actors and lawyers and kind of sharing information and downloading their experiences. So these playbook ideas and strategies get shared over time, and so you see them migrate from one context to the next. And so I think we can think of different moments in which that migration has played itself out, but the trajectories have been different. So the first one I think we can look at is the first Trump administration, where there were a lot of efforts made to kind of advance some of the same moves that we've seen in Hungary, but under the first Trump administration, because the officials and lawyers in particular that he had hired to populate his government came mostly from the mainstream conservative legal movement and were institutionalists at some basic level, even though we may disagree about policy.
Mm.
They refused to go in and to do the things that would have been necessary. And we saw this come to a head, obviously, in the challenge to the election, which was using the playbook that came out of Hungary very explicitly by claiming an emergency, right? So one of the things that autocrats do is they claim an emergency in order to enable them to invoke emergency powers. So the election system is rife with fraud. There's a national emergency. Therefore, I'm not going to leave office, right? This is straight out of the authoritarian or autocratic legal playbook. It didn't work because there were too many institutionalists in place that checked that from ultimately spilling over. But the thing that happens with these learning cycles is that once you have another chance at it, as he has now, he figured out that in order to be successful, you get rid of all the internal people that can act as roadblocks, and you put in people who are going to go all the way down the rabbit hole with you, and that's not what he has. So that was maybe point one. We then saw Brazil essentially trying to use the same strategy that Trump failed at in 2020 with respect to attacking the integrity of the presidential election, with Bolsonaro's attempt to maintain power in 2022 by essentially using the exact same strategy of claiming election fraud, attempting to mobilize the military, claiming an emergency, and ultimately calling people to the Capitol to protest and break into the government offices in a way that echoed precisely the January 6th insurrection. That also failed, and failed in part because the military wouldn't agree. And Brazil then took a different path in terms of how to address that moment, and they ended up in a very different place than we are now. And we can talk about that later if you'd like, but a very different trajectory. So I think that is one way of thinking about responding to the question, which is that learning happens in a two-way street around these authoritarian moments. And so the autocrats learn how to deploy these strategies to attack democratic institutions, but society and democratic social movements and democratically oriented lawyers that want to protect institutions also learn. And so when they start to see the signs now, as we see them happening in our country, we can take more proactive action, right? We can, in Brazil, they could they could see that this narrative of election fraud was being mobilized in a way that it was in the United States, and they took very aggressive legal action
Mm.
to shut it down, right? So that it didn't spill over and actually infect the system in such a way that ended up being, being a platform for authoritarianism to take root. So I think the two-way street aspect of this learning is really important. Um, in countries like Brazil, countries like Poland to some extent, right? They had a populist government. They backslid. There was much more resistance by the legal sector than we saw in Hungary, because Hungary is right next door, and Poland learned from Hungary, and they then forward slid, and now it's a little bit unclear. But there's more proactivity, I guess, and when you can see what's coming and are able to kind of respond in kind.
So what are, based on the examples that you provided in Hungary and Brazil, to some extent in Poland, what were some strategies that democratic oriented lawyers utilize that might be lessons that we can learn here in the US?
Well, I think I think the takeaways from other countries. I think we can take away lessons from our own history. I think we take away lessons from other countries in terms of how to fight for democracy and how to fight for a better democracy. And I think some of the principles that I take away from these other country experiences and our own experience are the need for creativity and thinking about how to address these problems. Solidarity is really important, and resilience, I think, are the three things that I would emphasize. And in terms of how to think about those principles, um, uh, you know, one of the things that I think is important so I spent a fair amount of time over the last couple of years interviewing lawyers on both sides of the rule of law conflict in Hungary, and I talked to also a fair number of lawyers in Poland. And one thing that stood out to me in terms of this creativity piece was just the sort of how to think about alternative venues of advocacy, because when traditional venues of advocacy get shut down, right, when the courts are captured and you can no longer go and ask the courts for redress, which is the kind of classical civil rights strategy from the United States, you have to figure out other places to go. To be clear, I don't think we're in that situation of having complete court capture, but I think the principle of adaptation into new venues, when ones that you've relied upon in the past are no longer functioning and no longer as effective, is really important. In the case of Hungary, I think that has meant something very specific, because Hungary is part of the European Union, and the European Union has institutions in place that are actually quite powerful and can play a significant in keeping uh, minded leaders within some boundary lines. And we obviously don't have that here in the United States, but I think, we have to think about other places to go than the places that we might have historically gone, i.e., the courts, in order to kind of mobilize new forms of democratic action against the center of power. And so there's lots of things that are happening at the state and local level. For example, I am someone who focuses on lawyers as agents of autocracy. And so one arena of advocacy that's kind of been newly tapped into are bar associations, which have historically been quite conservative institutions and not pro-democracy in any meaningful sense, but have been pushed in certain instances in the current environment to take action against lawyers who are violating their ethical obligations and attacking the rule of law. So I think we have to be creative in that regard, and to kind of think outside of the box and follow the lead of other lawyers in countries where authoritarianism has taken very firm root, but nonetheless they continue to find inspiration in other sources of authority that really can still put pressure on governments and to try to push them in the right direction. So I think that's one really important lesson. I think the other one, the sort of solidarity piece, is also really, really important. And I think it's the reason that we've seen this administration in the United States taking aim selectively at institutional actors at the elite level, both in terms of trying to pick off specific law firms, trying to pick off specific universities, trying to pick off a specific media actors, right? All of these are designed to undercut collective action and solidarity across institutional actors that are necessary to push back. Because once you see cracks at grassroots level, then it becomes very hard to consistently mobilize against these autocratic processes. And so staying in solidarity, and I think finding new forms of solidarity is really crucial. So the last thing I'll say about this is just that the other dimension that I think has been important to highlight in the United States has been kind of cross-ideological organizing between progressive and democratic social movements and I would call them rule of law conservatives who we would otherwise not have a necessary affinity for from a policy perspective, but who nonetheless, I believe, in some important situations have stood up quite forcefully for legal institutions and democratic norms in ways that have been very important. And so I think figuring out, because ultimately we need the institutions to function in order to advance the policies that we care about.
You've written extensively on movement lawyering and looked at alliances between lawyers and organizers and social movements. Um, Now, taking a more grassroots perspective, what are some strategies that perhaps organizers listening to this conversation may take into their own work? Because we've talked mostly about the lawyer's role and the lawyer's strategy, but from a movement lawyering, collective action perspective, what are some strategies that maybe non-lawyers can take in defending democratic institutions?
Well, I think people need to feel that they're safe, and people need to feel that there are people at the grassroots who are standing in solidarity with them. And I think that's the basis for grassroots collective action. And so I think one important thing that organizers can do in this moment is to convey to people who are being targeted, immigrants in particular that are being targeted, but other people whose lives are being disrupted as well, and who are increasingly facing insecurity and potential repression, that we are standing together and there are safe spaces for people to be in, and there are people that we all have to rely on each other in these difficult moments. I think public education is really critical right now. I'm not sure that people fully understand. I don't know if I even fully understand, having thought about and studied this quite extensively, the degree to which the basic fabrics of our democratic nation, imperfect as it is and flawed fundamentally as it always has been, are under systematic attack. And one of the things that often gets asked in these conversations is just how new this is, given our really repugnant history of democratic exclusion in this case. What's different now? And I think what my view is what's different now is the systematic and coordinated way in which the president and the administration are targeting every single barricade to power. I think this hasn't happened ever in our history at this top level. And so one of the things that we can all do, lawyers, non-lawyers, everyday people in their everyday interactions in their life, is to help educate each other about what's happening, and that the emphasis is that this is not an ad hoc situation. This is not Trump putting out a bunch of ideas that are not connected to one another and aren't. I think that message of giving this is dramatic affect all of our lives, no matter where you sit on the political spectrum in a very fundamental way, is something that we can all be talking to each other about in order to educate ourselves, because I think you have to understand what you're up against if you're going to effectively resist it. And I'm not sure that we all understand exactly what we're up against yet, and time is running out.
I'm glad you talked about education. This series, Law and Liberation, is seeking to precisely do that. If you were to distill maybe one or two key points that you want um, listeners to take away from what you think is not out there in the public discourse. You mentioned the public isn't fully aware of what's happening. Just in very maybe, kind of simple terms, like what would be one or two key points that you think that we need to know that we don't know at this moment?
I don't want to presume what people don't know. But I guess one of the things that I've been trying to convey, just based on my observations in relationship to what's happened elsewhere, is that when you look at all of these moves that are being made by the administration, right? Um, Attacks on judicial independence, right? Calling judges who rule against Trump orders left-wing lunatics and biased, attacking law firms, as we've already talked about, capturing the Department of Justice, putting in lawyers who are willing to do whatever the president wants, attacking the media, right? Going after Jimmy Kimmel for making a comment on the Charlie Kirk killing, and essentially shutting down his free speech and threatening the network with economic repercussions if they didn't do so, right? So really targeting media actors who might say anything that's contrary to the administration, then threatening to shut down funding for civil society organizations, saying that this is all part of a left-wing conspiracy funded by George Soros, and so we're going to take away the funding resources for organizations that we all know and have participated in and care about, groups like the ACLU and other grassroots organizations that are doing critical work. If you add all these things up, right, and even the language, right, Hungary, George Soros is Hungarian. George Soros funded through the Open Society Institute an incredible infrastructure of civil society organizations after Hungarian independence that were really responsible for bringing democracy to the country, and were then shut down by the Orban government precisely because they advanced human rights and were advocating for governmental accountability, and pushed out Soros's groups and funding and even the university that he created there, precisely because they were all advancing democratic values. So if you add up all of these specific targeting efforts and look at them, I think holistically, that I think the thing that I've been wanting just to emphasize on this is that leaders who do these things do them for one goal and one goal only, and that is to take and maintain permanent absolute power, right? They don't do these things and then walk away, right? They do these things because they want to stay. And I think we have to start to think as if the plan is that Trump and this administration are going to stay no matter what the people want. And so I think that, sort of the one way of thinking about this, and the message that I've been trying to crystallize around this idea, is that we need to think like an autocrat, right? Democratic resistance movements need to think like an autocrat. What would an autocrat do next? And to take autocratic leaders like Donald Trump at his word when he says, I want to stay in power beyond my term limited 2 terms, and to start to strategize and talk publicly about in a robust way to do now in 2025, start mobilizing to prevent that from happening, because maybe it is just bluster and maybe it won't ultimately come to pass, and that would be great. But if it's not, and we don't plan now, then we've already lost. And so I think we have to operate on this principle of better safe than sorry, take Trump at his word, things like an autocrat, and educate ourselves in what we can do in order to have a chance to create conditions of possibility that we can be successful.
Great. As a law professor, are there things that legal education and beyond law schools, you mentioned bar associations, can do to prepare or reorient lawyers for for this kind of democratic resistance to authoritarianism?
I think that law schools have to play a leading role. I guess a couple of things to be clear about. Lawyers have a key role to play in resistance. Lawyers cannot stop autocracy by ourselves, right? We can't do this by ourselves. But I think because these new authoritarian projects are fundamentally legalistic, lawyers have a very important role to play. I've already kind of suggested that one of the key roles is public education, kind of breaking down what is legal, what's not legal, and why we should all care about the distinction between those two things. I think you mentioned movement lawyering strategies, and I just want to emphasize because I didn't earlier that litigating these cases that are being taken on now against the government, right, representing immigrants who are being deported without access to lawyers and process at all, fighting back against illegal orders, executive orders like birthright citizenship and others like these are hugely important actions that lawyers are taking and litigating in court, even when you don't win, is a powerful form of symbolic politics, and it also slows down the gears of these autocratization processes in really important ways. So I think the legal sector generally has a really important role to play, although again, it cannot do it by itself. Like lawyers are not going to lawyer our way out of this particular problem. Because of that, but because lawyers have an important role, I think law schools also have a really critical role. And I think that the short version right now is that law schools are really fundamentally failing in this role. I think legal education. I mean, this is what we're seeing is an attack on the rule of law, which we are supposed to be teaching students every day about how to understand and protect. And so my view is that what's happening in our country should be the most important thing that we talk about in law school, and I think it has to be a matter of an institutional priority. The first thing that law students now coming into school should hear is that we have an unprecedented situation, and that we all have to do something about and educate ourselves and take action against. And I think it should be something that law students should hear every single day that they're in law school. While this is happening, so that they can understand and to equip themselves to uphold their obligations to defend the rule of law. You look at countries where autocratization has fully consolidated, and what it means to be a lawyer is very, very different than I think what we understand it to be now and what students are training themselves to be, because being a lawyer is in a country that is fully under authoritarian control is less about what you know than it is about who you know. And so all the training and investment that students are making, if our country loses grounding in the rule of law, won't be as relevant as they hope. And I think that's something that we really need to be communicating to students, that this is not business as usual anymore. So I think all I can say is what we're doing now is not that. And I also think that it shouldn't be on the shoulders of individual faculty or courses to do this work. I think this is law school wide institutional priority that should be effectuated. And I don't think it should be on individual law schools to do this work. I think this is back to the point of collective action. That's something that the legal profession and legal educators should have a unified voice on, right? This is not an ideological issue. This is not about whether you are for or against some of the policies that the Trump administration is putting out. This is about whether there's due process for people in our country,
Mhm.
and whether we're going to follow legal rules at a basic level. And that's something that we should all be able to get behind.
So just as we wind down this our conversation, which has been, really um, educational for me, and just thinking about the work that's ahead, what gives you hope about the legal profession's capacity to respond to this authoritarian resurgence, autocratic legalism, as you call it, in the US? And then also, I think there's a rising a new authoritarianism around the globe. I think there are other countries that we can talk about. What gives you hope, if at all, about this moment?
Well, I think I want to start by saying, just to be very clear, that we're in an extraordinarily dangerous situation, right? We're behind. They've gotten way out ahead. They have a plan and they're executing it with brutal efficiency. So it's dangerous, right? But I think we have to maintain hope that change is possible. And what does give me hope is that I have been going around the United States. I've also had opportunities to connect with people that care about these issues around the world. And there are lots of people engaged in important and courageous acts. Here in the United States, lawyers, I mentioned they're litigating these important cases. Lawyers are resigning from the government. They're getting fired from the government. They're resigning from the government. They're standing up to power. We've seen this with respect to recent resignations around these political prosecutions of Jim Comey and Tish James. Lawyers continue to speak out against the administration. They start up new law firms. They're litigating cases on behalf of people that are being persecuted, on behalf of agencies that are being gutted, and all of this matters, and are things that people don't have to be doing, but are investing their time in doing, and doing it very well, and even successfully in many cases. So I think I take inspiration from these acts of lawyers continuing to act, from just everyday people and organizers continuing to act. There's a No Kings rally on Saturday. We have to keep up the pressure in terms of mass mobilization, but also keep up, I think, the spotlight on these acts of individual resistance, because all of them matter. They aggregate, and if you study social movements, what you learn is that social movements succeed because hope creates positive momentum,
Mhm.
and positive momentum creates conditions of possibility for success. There's just a huge amount of uncertainty uh, in the system right now. Right? There's just a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen next. The only way that we have a chance to stop this and get our country back is for all of us to take steps forward and to build on these examples of resistance that we've seen, and to build momentum and strengthen the collective action. I think that's the path forward. It's not a path that ensures success, but it's the only path that's going to give us an opportunity to be successful. So I think, one of the things just to highlight, because there's so much negative news that comes out every single day. This is part of the strategy that they have, right? This is flood the zone. This is to demoralize people by putting out so much awful stuff every single day that you can't possibly understand what you could do to resist, right? Where you can fit in to make a difference. And I think the message is that everything you do matters, right? Small things matter, because social movements, democratic resistance movements succeed because lots of people do small things that build over time. And that's what we have to think of. We cannot think of how to address this at the macro level, because that will make people feel disoriented and disabled because it's so large. But the momentum and efforts on the other side are also strong, and individual acts matter. So do something specific, right? Whatever it is that you can do in front of you, these things are important. They build on one another. And I think that's what gives me hope for the future is that people are continuing to act at their peril in ways that I think are inspirational, and that we all have to find inspiration in this very dark time.
So I'm going to end with a question I ask all interviewees. This is a series, public education series on law plus liberation. From your perspective, from your observation, what does liberation mean to you? It can be in the context of your work against authoritarianism. It could be in the context of movement lawyering. Um, what does liberation mean to you? Or what does it look
I
like?
think liberation to me really means never giving up the fight for human equality and dignity, of never accepting that some people are less than just because they're different. I think it means recognizing that we may never see the liberation that we want, and that many of our ancestors that fought for liberation died without seeing the change that they fought their entire lives for, and that we all deserve to see, but we still have to go on. So I really think of liberation is in the struggle against the odds, and so for that, I think we're all engaged in constant liberation activism, right? And we have to do that now. Is the one of the most important thing that we can all be doing is the struggle. I think is what defines liberation for me.